The desert wind carried the scent of aviation fuel and something else, something that made General Marcus Thorne's weathered face harden as he stepped from his Humvee. Forward operating base Kestrel stretched before him like a mirage of military efficiency. Rows of tan prefab buildings, helicopters arranged in perfect formation, and soldiers moving with the practiced urgency of a deployment that had already claimed too many. But it wasn't the organized chaos that caught his attention. It was the woman lying on her back beneath the belly of an I-64 Apache, her legs extending from the shadow of the gunship like she belonged there. Staff Sergeant Kira Ghost Valdez had been under that bird for 3 hours, her calloused hands working through a hydraulic issue that had stumped 2 other mechanics. The nameplate on her desert camouflage read simply VALDZ, but it was the patch on her right shoulder that made Thorne's breath catch. Faded and worn, barely visible against the fabric, a stylized raven with wings spread wide, clutching lightning bolts. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. The Night Stalkers. That patch, Thorne said, his voice cutting through the mechanical symphony of the motor pool. Where'd you get it? Valdez didn't slide out immediately. First came the sound of her wrench hitting something metallic, followed by a colorful string of Spanish that would have made a drill sergeant blush. Then she emerged, her face streaked with hydraulic fluid and grime, dark hair escaping from her regulation bun. Her eyes, steel gray like storm clouds, fixed on the general's face without flinching. "Earned it, sir," she said, wiping her hands on a rag that had seen better decades. Around them, the motor pool had gone silent. Mechanics froze mid-task, sensing the electricity in the air. Captain Bradley Reeves, the base's executive officer, stepped forward with the nervous energy of a man trying to defuse a situation he didn't understand. "General, this is Staff Sergeant Valdez. She transferred in from the 82nd Airborne last month. Been doing good work on our birds." His tone carried the diplomatic weight of someone trying to protect a subordinate from a superior's attention. But Thorne wasn't looking at Reeves. He was studying Valdez's face, searching for something in her expression that matched the ghost of a memory from 15 years ago. Afghanistan, a night mission that went sideways, a pilot who saved his convoy when everything fell apart. "You fly, Sergeant." The question hung in the desert air like heat shimmer. Valdez's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment her mask slipped. In that instant, Thorne saw it, the weight of something unspoken, heavy as classified documents and twice as dangerous. "Not anymore, sir." Those 2 words carried enough pain to fuel a war. Thorne nodded slowly, recognizing the tone of someone whose wings had been clipped by circumstances beyond their control. He'd heard it before, in the voices of pilots grounded by injury, by politics, by the cruel mathematics of military bureaucracy. The Apache's engine coughed to life behind them, a testament to Valdez's mechanical expertise. But as the rotors began their lazy rotation, casting dancing shadows across the tarmac, neither the general nor the sergeant seemed to notice. They were locked in a moment that stretched back through years of service, sacrifice, and secrets that the desert sand had buried but never forgotten. Captain Reeves shifted uncomfortably, sensing undercurrents he couldn't navigate. The other mechanics remained frozen, tools in hand, waiting for whatever came next. In the distance, a radio crackled with routine traffic, supply requests, maintenance updates, the mundane communications that kept a forward operating base running. But here, in the shadow of the Apache, silence spoke louder than any transmission. Valdez broke eye contact first, turning back toward her tools with the practiced dismissal of someone who had learned not to hope. But Thorne remained, his eyes fixed on that faded patch, his mind working through possibilities that could change everything. The desert wind picked up, carrying dust and the promise of something that felt remarkably like destiny. The morning briefing at FOB Kestrel usually followed a predictable rhythm. Intelligence updates that revealed nothing new, logistics reports that highlighted everything they lacked, and operational summaries that danced around the increasingly dangerous reality of their situation. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base commander, ran these meetings with the efficiency of someone who had learned to extract maximum information from minimum time. But today felt different. Today, General Thorne sat at the head of the table, his presence transforming routine into something that carried weight. The situation in Sector 7 has deteriorated, Major Lisa Santos, the intelligence officer, announced as she clicked through satellite images on the projector screen. Taliban forces have increased their presence by 60% over the last 2 weeks. They're using the mountain passes to move heavy weapons, and our conventional air assets haven't been able to establish effective interdiction. The images showed rocky terrain that looked like God's abandoned construction project, jagged peaks, narrow valleys, and caves that could hide an army. It was the kind of landscape that turned helicopters into flying coffins and pilots into statistics. "What about close air support?" Colonel Hayes asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't be good. "Limited effectiveness," Santos replied. "The peaks are too high for most of our rotary assets to operate effectively. Fixed wing can't get low enough for precision strikes without unacceptable risk. We've lost 2 Kiowas in the last month trying to establish surveillance." Captain Reeves leaned forward, his face bearing the expression of someone about to deliver more bad news. "Sir, we're also facing a pilot shortage. The replacements from Kandahar got diverted to support operations in Helmand Province. We're down to 4 qualified pilots for 6 birds." Thorne's fingers drummed against the table, a rhythmic tapping that somehow managed to sound like distant rotors. His eyes moved around the room, cataloging faces and capabilities, conducting some internal calculation that no one else could follow. "What kind of birds?" he asked quietly. "2 Apache, 2 Black Hawks, 1 Kiowa, and a Chinook that's been down for parts for 3 weeks, Hayes answered. "The Apache are our primary assets for sector patrol, but without adequate pilot rotation, we're running crews into fatigue cycles that violate safety protocols." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning unit fighting a losing battle against the Afghan heat. Outside, they could hear the routine sounds of base life, vehicles moving, personnel calling to each other, the distant whine of a helicopter spooling up for departure. But inside this conference room, the weight of impossible mathematics pressed down on everyone present. "Show me the flight roster," Thorne said. Hayes nodded to her aide, who pulled up a digital display on the wall monitor. Names, aircraft assignments, flight hours, and medical status, the bureaucratic skeleton of aerial warfare. Thorne studied it with the intensity of someone reading tea leaves, looking for patterns that others might miss. "Chief Warrant Officer Davidson is our most experienced Apache pilot," Hayes explained, pointing to a name highlighted in green. "But he's been flying double shifts for 2 weeks. Martinez and Thompson are solid on the Black Hawks, but neither has significant mountain experience." "And the Apache co-pilot positions?" "Mostly junior officers. Good training, limited combat experience. The kind of crews that work fine for routine patrols, but—" Hayes didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood the mathematics of combat aviation. Experience plus training equaled survival, and they were running dangerously low on the first variable. Thorne stood, walking to the window that looked out over the flight line. In the distance, Staff Sergeant Valdez was visible beneath another helicopter, her legs extending from the shadow of a Black Hawk like she'd grown roots in the tarmac. Her efficiency was obvious even from this distance. Tools appeared and disappeared with practiced precision, no wasted motion, no hesitation. "That Sergeant," Thorne said without turning around. "Valdez, what's her full story?" The question created an uncomfortable ripple of silence. Captain Reeves cleared his throat, the sound carrying the weight of someone about to discuss topics that lived in classified folders. Sir, her personnel file shows standard enlisted progression, maintenance specialty, solid performance reviews. She transferred from the 82nd after, he paused, consulting his tablet, after a non-combat medical incident. Details are redacted above my clearance level. But Thorne was already moving toward the door, his decision made with the sudden certainty of someone who had recognized a solution hiding in plain sight. The briefing room emptied behind him as officers scrambled to keep up, but his focus remained fixed on the woman under the helicopter, the ghost from his past who might hold the key to their future. The helicopter maintenance bay at Fob Kestrel existed in a permanent state of controlled chaos. Tools hung from pegboards with the precision of surgical instruments. Parts bins lined shelves like metallic organs waiting for transplant, and the air thrummed with the constant background noise of turbine engines, hydraulic pumps, and human expertise applied to machines that defied gravity through sheer mechanical willpower. It was here, surrounded by the guts of multi-million-dollar aircraft, that Staff Sergeant Kira Valdez had found something approaching peace. Her hands moved through the Apache's engine compartment with the confidence of someone who understood these machines at a molecular level. Each component had its own language, the whine of a bearing going bad, the subtle vibration that indicated a rotor imbalance, the barely perceptible change in hydraulic pressure that meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She spoke these languages fluently, and the helicopters responded to her touch like thoroughbred horses recognizing their trainer. Valdez, General Thorne's voice cut through the mechanical symphony, causing several nearby mechanics to freeze mid-task. Walk with me. It wasn't a request. Valdez set down her torque wrench with deliberate precision, wiped her hands on the omnipresent rag, and followed the general toward a quieter corner of the hangar. Behind them, whispered conversations erupted like small explosions, enlisted personnel trying to decode why a general was personally interested in a staff sergeant who kept to herself and did her job without fanfare. They stopped beside a maintenance ladder that reached toward the hangar's corrugated metal roof. Above them, heat shimmer created dancing patterns that looked like mirages, but Thorne's attention remained fixed on Valdez's face, searching for something that lived behind her carefully maintained professional mask. 15 years ago, he began, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. Kunar Province. A convoy got hit by IEDs and small arms fire, pinned down in a valley that was supposed to be secure. The quick reaction force couldn't get through, too much ground fire, terrain too complex for conventional approach. Valdez's expression remained neutral, but her shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly, a defensive posture that suggested the general was walking through dangerous territory. Then this night stalker appears out of nowhere, Thorne continued, flying an Apache like it was part of her own nervous system, took out 3 RPG positions and a mortar team while taking heavy fire. Pilot never identified herself on the radio, just appeared, saved 17 soldiers, and disappeared back into the mountains. The hangar's ambient noise seemed to fade around them, creating a pocket of silence that felt heavier than the Afghanistan heat. Valdez's jaw tightened, but she remained silent, her gray eyes fixed on some distant point beyond Thorne's shoulder. Ghost 77, Thorne said quietly. That was the call sign. Never appeared in any official reports. No after-action reviews, no commendations, no trace in the system. But I remember that voice on the radio. Calm as winter morning, professional as a surgical procedure. And I remember thinking that whoever was flying that bird understood something about warfare that the rest of us were still learning. Sir, Valdez said carefully, I think you might have me confused with someone else. But Thorne shook his head, a slight smile creasing his weathered features. The voice was distinctive, slight accent, New Mexico, maybe Arizona, and there was something else. During the extraction, when the bird was taking fire, the pilot said something in Spanish. A prayer, maybe, or a curse. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. Valdez's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something raw and complicated underneath. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of memories that had been buried but never forgotten. "That was a long time ago, General." "Not long enough to forget," Thorne replied. "And not long enough for the Army to forget either. That mission saved lives, Sergeant. American lives. The kind of flying that gets written about in tactical manuals and talked about in staff colleges. The kind of flying that also gets people killed," Valdez said, her voice sharp enough to cut Kevlar. "Or worse, gets them grounded permanently for medical reasons that have nothing to do with their ability to fly." The bitterness in her tone revealed more than her words. Thorne nodded slowly, beginning to understand the shape of the tragedy that had transformed a legendary pilot into a maintenance sergeant who kept her head down and her mouth shut. Around them, the helicopter maintenance continued, but the two of them remained locked in their conversation, surrounded by machines that represented both salvation and destruction, freedom and imprisonment. The general studied the sergeant's face, seeing past the grease stains and regulation haircut to the aviator who still lived underneath, waiting for someone to call her back to the sky. "What happened?" he asked simply. The weight of that question settled between them like unexploded ordnance. Valdez's eyes moved to the Apache she'd been working on, its rotor blades folded like the wings of a sleeping predator. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the hollow echo of someone describing events that had occurred to someone else in another life. The recreation tent at Fob Kestrel served multiple functions: movie theater, chapel, confession booth, and refuge for soldiers who needed to escape the relentless pressure of deployment, even if only for a few minutes. It was here, surrounded by folding chairs and the persistent hum of generators, that Staff Sergeant Valdez finally told her story. General Thorne sat across from her, 2 cups of coffee growing cold on the plastic table between them, as words spilled out of her like hydraulic fluid from a ruptured line. "The medical incident," she began, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup like it was an anchor. "That's what they called it in the reports. Very clean, very bureaucratic. Doesn't mention the nightmares or the way my hands shake when I hear certain sounds." Thorne remained silent, recognizing the fragile momentum of someone finally ready to excavate buried trauma. Outside the tent, the base continued its 24-hour cycle of controlled urgency, but inside, time moved differently. "It was supposed to be a routine extraction," Valdez continued. "Medical evacuation from a forward fire base that had taken casualties during a Taliban assault. Simple mission profile: get in, load the wounded, get out. I was flying co-pilot in an Apache, providing cover for the medevac bird." Her voice carried the mechanical precision of someone who had relived these events countless times, each detail burned into memory with the permanence of scar tissue. The firebase was in a valley surrounded by ridgelands, perfect terrain for an ambush, but intelligence said the area was clear. The medevac bird, a black hawk with red cross markings, went in first. We maintained overwatch from altitude, scanning for threats. She paused, her gray eyes focusing on something beyond the tent walls, beyond the base, beyond Afghanistan entirely. "They hit the medevac bird with an RPG just as it was lifting off. Direct hit to the tail boom. The bird went down hard, right in the middle of the landing zone. Suddenly, we had wounded soldiers from the original attack plus a downed aircrew, and the Taliban had pre-positioned fighting positions all around the perimeter." Thorne leaned forward slightly, understanding beginning to form in his expression. He'd read enough after-action reports to recognize the setup for the kind of tragedy that haunted military aviators long after they'd hung up their flight suits. "My pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Rebecca Santos, she was one of the best Apache drivers in the regiment. 15 years of experience, over 2,000 combat hours. She wanted to call for reinforcements, establish a proper suppression pattern before attempting any rescue. but the medevac crew was taking fire, and there were wounded soldiers bleeding out in the dirt. Valdez's voice began to change, taking on the flat affect of someone describing events too painful for normal emotional processing. I convinced her to go in, told her we could suppress the enemy positions long enough for a ground evacuation. I was wrong. The tent fell completely silent except for the distant sound of a helicopter taking off somewhere on the base. The rhythmic thump of rotor blades seemed to pull Valdez deeper into her memories, her expression becoming distant and haunted. We went in low and fast, but they were ready for us. Coordinated fire from multiple positions, small arms, RPGs, even a recoilless rifle they'd positioned on the north ridgeline. We took hits immediately. Hydraulics, electrical systems, engine oil pressure dropping. She stopped speaking, her hands beginning to tremble slightly around the coffee cup. Thorne noticed but said nothing, allowing her to find her rhythm again. Santos was fighting to keep us airborne, trying to reach minimum safe distance for emergency landing. But there was a second medevac bird inbound, crew that didn't know the landing zone was compromised. They were flying straight into the same ambush that had killed their teammates. Understanding dawned in Thorne's eyes. He'd served long enough to recognize the moral calculus that defined moments like these, impossible choices that left scars regardless of which option was chosen. I took the controls, Valdez said quietly. Santos was unconscious from blood loss and our bird was dying around us. But that second medevac was 30 seconds out from the same fate as the first, so I used our Apache as a shield. Her voice became barely audible, forcing Thorne to lean closer to catch her words. Flew directly between the incoming bird and the enemy positions. Took every round they had while the medevac extracted the survivors. Our Apache absorbed enough fire to stock a small war, but the rescue bird made it out clean. "And you?" Thorne asked gently. Valdez's laugh carried no humor, only the bitter recognition of someone who had survived when survival felt like failure. Spinal compression fractures from the hard landing, traumatic brain injury from concussion, PTSD severe enough that I couldn't function in a cockpit without panic attacks. The flight surgeons grounded me permanently, said I was a danger to myself and any crew that flew with me. The tense silence stretched between them like a canyon that couldn't be bridged with words. Thorne studied her face, seeing past the present to the pilot who had sacrificed everything to save strangers, then been discarded by the same system she'd sworn to serve. "The Night Stalkers offered me a medical discharge," she continued. "Full benefits, disability rating, clean separation, but I couldn't leave. This," she gestured toward the tent walls, toward the base beyond, toward something larger than geography, "this is all I know how to do. So they transferred me to maintenance. Let me keep touching the birds even if I can't fly them anymore." General Thorne sat back in his chair, his mind processing implications that extended far beyond one soldier's personal tragedy. Around them, the base continued its relentless operations, but here in this tent, surrounded by folding chairs and the lingering scent of institutional coffee, he was beginning to understand the true cost of the war they were fighting, not just in casualties and equipment, but in the dreams they were asking soldiers to sacrifice on the altar of mission accomplishment. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fob Kestrel's flight line as General Thorne walked alone among the helicopters, his mind working through calculations that had nothing to do with fuel loads or ammunition counts. The conversation with Valdez had revealed a resource that officially didn't exist, a pilot whose capabilities exceeded her current position by margins that could be measured in lives saved and missions accomplished. But it had also revealed the institutional barrier that kept exceptional people trapped in roles that wasted their talents. Behind him, the daily battle rhythm of the forward operating base was beginning. Maintenance crews conducting pre-flight inspections, pilots reviewing mission folders, support personnel moving supplies and ammunition to aircraft that would soon carry death and salvation to places marked on maps with the clinical precision of military planning. But Thorne's attention remained fixed on the woman emerging from beneath an Apache, her uniform already stained with hydraulic fluid despite the early hour. Staff Sergeant Valdez moved around the aircraft with the unconscious grace of someone who understood these machines at an intuitive level. Her inspection was thorough, but efficient, each check performed with the muscle memory of thousands of previous examinations. She paused at the Apache's weapon systems, running her hands along the chain gun mount with the gentle touch of someone greeting an old friend. "Sergeant," Thorne called as he approached, "a word." She straightened, wiping her hands on the eternal rag that seemed permanently attached to her belt. Her expression remained carefully neutral, but Thorne caught the subtle tension around her eyes, the wariness of someone who had learned that attention from senior officers rarely brought good news. "Sir, I've been reviewing our operational requirements," he began, choosing his words with the precision of a diplomatic negotiation. "The situation in Sector 7 is deteriorating faster than our current assets can address. We need capabilities that go beyond standard flight profiles." Valdez nodded politely, but her body language suggested she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Around them, the flight line continued its choreographed chaos, but their conversation existed in a bubble of possibility that neither had yet acknowledged. "The terrain requires precision flying under conditions that would challenge our most experienced pilots," Thorne continued. "Mountain valleys with unpredictable wind patterns, landing zones that exist only in theory, extraction scenarios that demand split-second decision-making under fire." "Sir, with respect," Valdez interrupted, "I think you're overestimating what I can contribute to that kind of mission. I'm maintenance now. Haven't touched flight controls in 3 years." But Thorne shook his head, his expression carrying the weight of command decisions that would ripple through multiple lives. "I'm not overestimating anything, Sergeant. I'm looking at a pilot who flew an Apache through a coordinated ambush to save a medevac crew. Someone who understands that aircraft at a level that can't be taught in flight school or acquired through routine training." He paused, studying her face for signs of the aviator that still lived beneath the maintenance sergeant's exterior. "The question is whether that pilot still exists, or whether the medical board's assessment was accurate." The challenge hung in the air between them like rote or wash, invisible but impossible to ignore. Valdez's jaw tightened, and for a moment Thorne saw a flash of the steel that had once made her legendary among the Night Stalkers. The medical assessment was thorough, general. Multiple flight surgeons, psychological evaluations, physical therapy assessments. They didn't ground me on a whim. "Medical assessments can be wrong," Thorne replied, "especially when they're based on conditions that may have changed over time. PTSD responds to treatment. Physical injuries heal. The question is whether you're willing to find out." Around them, an Apache was spooling up for departure, its turbine engines creating a wall of sound that made conversation impossible. But in the brief silence that followed, Valdez's expression underwent a subtle transformation, the carefully maintained mask of professional neutrality beginning to crack under the pressure of possibilities she had forced herself to stop imagining. "What exactly are you proposing, sir?" Thorne's smile carried the satisfaction of someone who had recognized the exact moment when defense became interest. "A flight evaluation, unofficial, conducted under medical supervision. If you can pass basic proficiency standards, we process a temporary medical waiver for emergency operational requirements. And if I can't, then you go back to maintenance and we find another solution to our pilot shortage." His voice softened slightly. "But either way, you'll know. No more wondering what might have been possible." The offer settled between them like unexploded ordnance, dangerous, potentially life-changing, impossible to ignore. Valdez's eyes moved to the Apache behind her, its weapon systems gleaming in the morning sun, its rotor blades folded in preparation for flight. When she looked back at Thorn, her expression carried the weight of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, calculating whether the fall would kill her or teach her to fly. "When?" she asked quietly. "This afternoon. Hangar 7, just you, me, and a flight surgeon who owes me a favor." The words hung in the desert air like a promise, or possibly a threat. Neither of them was entirely sure which. Hangar 7 existed on the periphery of Fob Kestrel's flight operations, a corrugated metal structure that housed maintenance overflow and equipment too sensitive for outdoor storage. It was here, away from the curious eyes of base personnel, that General Thorn had arranged what could charitably be called an unofficial flight evaluation, and more accurately described as a carefully orchestrated resurrection. The Apache sitting in the hangar's center had been stripped of its standard mission configuration. No external weapons pylons, no targeting systems, just the basic airframe and flight controls necessary to determine whether Staff Sergeant Valdez could still perform the fundamental task of keeping a rotorcraft airborne. Dr. Captain Maria Restrepo, the base's senior flight surgeon, stood beside the aircraft with a tablet computer and the skeptical expression of someone who had seen too many broken pilots, convinced they could return to flight status through willpower alone. "The evaluation parameters are straightforward," Dr. Restrepo explained as Valdez approached the helicopter. "Basic flight proficiency, emergency procedures, physiological response monitoring. We're looking for any signs of panic response, spatial disorientation, or motor function degradation." Valdez nodded, but her attention remained fixed on the Apache's cockpit, her gray eyes cataloging instruments and controls with the intensity of someone studying a foreign language she had once spoken fluently. Her hands trembled slightly, barely perceptible, but enough to make Thorn wonder if this was compassionate rehabilitation or elaborate cruelty. "The medical monitoring is non-negotiable," Dr. Restrepo continued. "Heart rate, blood pressure, stress indicators, any sign of psychological distress, and we terminate immediately." "Understood," Valdez replied, though her voice carried the hollow tone of someone agreeing to terms they hadn't fully processed. She approached the Apache slowly, her movements gaining confidence with each step. The pre-flight inspection was muscle memory made manifest, hands moving across control surfaces, checking fluid levels, testing control linkages with the unconscious precision of someone who had performed these actions thousands of times. But when she reached the cockpit, she hesitated. The pilot's seat waited like a throne she had been exiled from, its complex array of switches and displays both familiar and alien. She placed one hand on the armrest, her fingers tracing the worn fabric where countless hours of flight time had left their mark. "Take your time," Thorn said quietly. But time wasn't the issue. The issue was stepping across a threshold that she had convinced herself no longer existed, reclaiming an identity that the medical board had declared dead and buried. She closed her eyes for a moment, and in that brief darkness, she could hear the ghost of rotor blades cutting through Afghan air, feel the phantom sensation of an aircraft responding to her commands like an extension of her own nervous system. When she opened her eyes, something had changed. The careful neutrality was gone, replaced by the focused intensity of someone remembering who they used to be. She climbed into the cockpit. The Apache's interior embraced her like a familiar lover, every switch exactly where her muscle memory expected, every instrument positioned within the precise reach her hands remembered. She began the startup sequence with deliberate care, each action triggering cascading memories of missions flown and dangers navigated. "Engine parameters normal," she called, her voice taking on the professional cadence of someone who had spent years conducting these procedures under circumstances that measured success in lives saved rather than evaluation points scored. The Apache's twin turboshaft engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, building toward the operational RPM that would transform this collection of metal and machinery into something approaching magic. Valdez's hands moved across the control panel with increasing confidence, and Thorne noticed that her trembling had stopped entirely. "Request permission for hover check," she called through the intercom. Dr. Restrepo consulted her monitoring equipment, studying the biometric data streaming from sensors attached to Valdez's body. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but Thorne caught the slight nod that indicated the physiological indicators remained within acceptable parameters. "Permission granted," Thorne replied. The Apache lifted from the hangar floor with the smooth precision of someone who understood the delicate balance between collective pitch, cyclic control, and anti-torque pedals that kept a helicopter from becoming an extremely expensive piece of abstract sculpture. But this wasn't merely competent flying. This was artistry disguised as technical proficiency. Valdez held the aircraft in a perfect hover, the skids exactly 3 feet above the concrete, the fuselage level as a carpenter's dream. She transitioned smoothly between forward, backward, and lateral movement, each maneuver executed with the fluid grace of someone for whom the helicopter had become an extension of their own body. "Remarkable," Dr. Restrepo murmured, studying her tablet. "Heart rate is actually decreasing. Stress indicators are dropping below baseline levels." Thorne wasn't surprised. He was watching someone come home. The hangar test flight lasted 30 minutes, but it felt like a compressed lifetime of reacquaintance between pilot and machine. When Valdez finally set the Apache back onto its landing skids, the silence that followed carried the weight of possibilities that neither of them had dared to fully articulate. She shut down the engines with the same methodical precision she had used to start them, but when she removed her helmet, her expression had been transformed. The careful neutrality was gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably like hope. "Well," Thorne asked Dr. Restrepo. The flight surgeon consulted her tablet one final time, before looking up with the expression of someone forced to revise long-held assumptions. "From a medical standpoint, I see no physiological barriers to limited flight duty," she said carefully. "The psychological indicators suggest that flying may actually have a therapeutic effect rather than a traumatic one." She paused, studying Valdez with the clinical interest of someone observing an unexpected recovery. "However, I'm recommending a graduated return to flight status. Limited duty initially, with regular medical monitoring and psychological evaluation." Valdez climbed out of the cockpit with movements that carried none of the hesitation she had shown climbing in. When her feet touched the hangar floor, she turned to face Thorne with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and determination. "What happens now, General?" Thorne's smile carried the satisfaction of someone who had solved a puzzle that others had declared unsolvable. "Now we find out if you remember how to fight." The briefing room at FOB Kestrel had been transformed into a tactical planning center, its walls covered with maps, satellite photographs, and intelligence summaries that painted a picture of escalating violence in the mountains beyond the base's protective perimeter. Staff Sergeant Valdez, now temporarily redesignated as Chief Warrant Officer Valdez pending medical review, sat among the other aircrew members with the uncomfortable posture of someone who wasn't entirely sure they belonged in the room. Major Santos, the intelligence officer, stood before a digital display showing terrain that looked like a three-dimensional nightmare. Jagged peaks, narrow valleys, and passes that seemed designed by a malevolent god to trap unwary aircraft in killing fields of crossfire and limited maneuver space. "The situation has deteriorated significantly over the past 72 hours, Santos began, her pointer tracing routes through the mountain passes with the precision of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. "Taliban forces have established supply routes through the Khyber Pass complex, moving heavy weapons and personnel into positions that threaten our forward operating bases throughout the region. The photographs on the screen shifted to show intelligence imagery. Convoys of vehicles, personnel gathering around what appeared to be weapons caches, fighting positions carved into mountainsides with the permanent solidity of someone planning to stay. Conventional air assets have proven ineffective, Santos continued. Fixed-wing aircraft can't operate effectively at the altitudes required, and our current rotary-wing assets lack the high-altitude performance necessary for sustained operations in this terrain. Colonel Hayes leaned forward from her position at the head of the conference table, her expression carrying the weight of someone who had run out of good options and was now choosing between various degrees of unacceptable risk. "What about special operations aviation?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "The 160th is committed to operations in Helmand Province," Santos replied. "Earliest availability for redeployment would be 6 weeks, assuming no changes in their current mission parameters." The room fell silent except for the persistent hum of air conditioning fighting a losing battle against the Afghan heat. Outside, they could hear the routine sounds of base operations, but inside this briefing room, the mathematics of warfare were revealing their cruel logic. Too many threats, too few assets, too little time. General Thorne studied the terrain imagery with the intensity of someone reading a tactical problem that had no obvious solution. His eyes moved from the mountain passes to the helicopter assets available, calculating fuel loads and flight times against target acquisition and engagement parameters. "What about interdiction missions?" he asked quietly, "disrupting the supply routes before they can establish permanent positions." Major Santos clicked to a new slide showing flight paths superimposed over the terrain map. Red lines indicated enemy surface-to-air missile coverage. Yellow zones marked areas of small arms concentration, and the resulting safe corridors were depressingly narrow. "High risk, moderate probability of success," she replied. "The terrain channels aircraft into predictable flight paths, and intelligence indicates the enemy has positioned anti-aircraft weapons specifically to target helicopters transiting these areas." Chief Warrant Officer Davidson, the base's senior Apache pilot, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His flight experience was extensive, but the mission parameters being discussed pushed the boundaries of what conventional tactics could accomplish. "Sir, with respect," Davidson said carefully, "the altitude and terrain requirements are outside the performance envelope for standard approach profiles. We'd be operating at the edge of our aircraft capabilities while exposed to concentrated ground fire." But Valdez was studying the terrain imagery with different eyes, not the conservative calculation of someone protecting existing assets, but the aggressive assessment of someone who understood that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary solutions. "The northern approach," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the room's tactical pessimism. "Through the Shukti Pass. It's not on any of the standard flight corridors." Santos clicked to a detailed view of the area Valdez had indicated.